Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another Audit Tuesday. So, an important topic today, the concept and problem of the ego and the startup entrepreneur CEO. So, leading the discussion is startup expert, professor, CTO, and author of Death by Ego Lessons from Entrepreneurs Who Successfully Killed Their Companies, David Carleson. So also joining us is Dave McConnell, startup investment expert, and then our own serial entrepreneur, UATest CEO, Garret Grajek. Hi, everyone.
Greetings, Ashley.
Morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Okay, so lots to cover today. So let's start with you, David Carleson. Can you give the Audit Tuesday audience a little bit of your background and why you wrote your book, Death by Ego?
Yeah, and thank you. And Garret, thank you for inviting me. My academic background includes a BS in math, MS in business, PhD in engineering, and postdoctoral work in finance, all from the University of Michigan, and corporate governance at Stanford. After 45 years as a chief technology officer, I began consulting and serving as a fractional finance officer. The book really started in 2022 when I was serving as an interim chief financial officer of a company in Southern California. When the lead investor asked what happened to all of the money he had invested in the company before I started, I did a thorough review of all expenses and the budgets. I discovered that the two founders had embezzled about $2.5 million. When I took this to the lead investor, he said, and this is a near direct quote, "I really like working with these guys. And if they had asked, I would have given them the money." I knew I was toast, and my contract was terminated the next day. I was so angry that I decided to write up this experience and then discovered that I had several others that were, I think, relevant. The result was Death by Ego. When the book was written a few years ago, the two public companies both had disappeared, and 8 of the 9 private companies were no longer in business. 3 weeks ago, the last of the private companies which had used a SPAC to go public went bankrupt. So my book is 11 for 11 for explaining and predicting failures.
Wow. So, Dave McConnell, is what Professor Carlson's saying resonate with what you see out in the field?
In fact, we worked on one company together. I was working on the equity funding, and he was working on the inside as CEO. And yeah, we did discover some character defects in the CEO, and I didn't remain much longer, but he can tell you more about that.
So, Professor Carlson, this ego problem in startup entrepreneurs is a real thing. So, can you lead with any examples you've seen in the real world where you've seen this occur?
Well, first of all, the company that David McConnell and I worked with is Chapter 10 in the book. And all the names have been changed to protect the guilty, not the innocent, the guilty. But one of the cases in the book, actually covered in Chapter 2, involves an extremely successful entrepreneur who took his company public on the New York Stock Exchange. And the year after he went public, the company was the highest gaining percentage equity company on the New York Stock Exchange. 2 years later, it was sold to a competitor for 98% discount from what it had been at its high. But an example was when this entrepreneur decided that if he didn't change the compensation program for his top 3 salesmen, each of them would make more money than he did in the current fiscal year. All of his advisors, including myself, strongly advised against his changing the compensation plan. He executed the plan, and the company missed its 4th quarter sales objective by the largest amount in its history. The 3 salespeople, and I talked to all of them after the fact, had simply convinced their customers think about these customers, Walgreens, Walmart, and Super Value, to delay all orders until the first quarter because the CEO had changed their compensation program. Within 2 years, the company had lost 95% of its public value. The founder CEO was replaced and it was sold to a competitor at less than 3% of its highest value. There are probably 20 other stories in the book, but this is a profound example of the entrepreneur's arrogance and hubris.
So, Garret, since you've been on both sides of the fence, where have you seen this trait in any startup CEOs that you have worked in?
It's a fascinating topic. I mean, first of all, thanks for taking time to read the book. To write the book, Professor Carleson. And I swear you probably didn't have any problems getting the people who worked for these people to give you horror stories. I just have to think, right? Because I've been in a few of these cases, and it's mind blowing. And I'll have more to say on a different topic later about it. But it is an unfortunate trait, especially trait in the IT world, because in the IT world we are taught as just purveyors of this industry, questions after questions, and always have the answer. Always have the answer. And it's the opposite, Professor Carleson, to being collaborative. It's the right way to do the job. And I'm not saying I'm perfect by no means, but I see the ones who are really good. The right way to do this job is to acknowledge that you don't know everything. You need the people around you. The people around you are a heck of a lot better at what they do than you could do their job. And that we, as the CEO, have to sit here and say, please do your job. What do I need to get you to do your job? What do I need to help you? But I can see how the dichotomy of the job, where people are always putting in their spot. The gentleman David McConnell does a wonderful investor group, where he has people both sides. He has the investors stand up and he has the inventors stand up, and they tell you what you're doing, and then people go and ask each other, what do you do? What do you do? And in those sessions, there's a lot of, I can see, I acknowledge where the hubris comes from, because in those questions that person's asked and is expected to not only have a good answer, not just a good answer, and this is where it gets tough, Professor Carleson, not only a good answer in content, but a good answer in format and in style and delivery and succinctness, etc. So it's easy, what I think is easy, it's easy to start believing your own stuff. And that's where I think a book like yours is so utterly important, not just for the investors, but for the CEOs, to start realizing, yes, you have to give an answer. Yes, it has to be as good as, but by all means, we're as frail and as fraudulent and as erred and flawed as everyone else out there. So not believe your own hype.
And Dave, since you work so closely with the investment community, do you see entrepreneur egos as red flags for the investors?
Sure. In fact, I published 4 necessary conditions for me to consult with the company a little more than 10 years ago with a gentleman named J.J. Risha, who's also a member of this network that Garret talked about, and so is David. And rather than take the psychological approach, because I'm not a doctor or a psychologist, I tried to take the just nuts and bolts of a company to figure out the necessary conditions. Now, got to understand, necessary conditions are not necessary and sufficient. They might not be, but they're roadblocks. They're a template to screen out companies. I can just name them briefly, but there's also in the chat, I have a newsletter. If anybody wants to email me at that email, I can send it to them. It's a document from 2013. Number 1, I have to work with the CEO of the company. Why? Couldn't I work with somebody else, the CFO, the board, or something like that? I could, but then the success potential goes way down, way down. So why should I do it? I don't. I don't do it, period. Number two, people think that they don't have to have money to raise money. And I make them keenly aware of how much money it's going to cost to raise money. And if they don't have a budget for that, it's time for them to go back and rethink it. The third thing is the team. I've had a number of companies. Here's where dishonesty comes into play. They name people who are phantom people. In other words, they're not full-time with the company. And if that was just disclosed correctly, that could be a positive. It could be a possible use of funds. It could attract investment. And so this tendency to be dishonest, I noticed that. And I have a longer story to tell sometime from the movie industry. But anyway, the fourth point is valuation. People can get really incorrect ideas of how much their company is worth, what the market cap value of the company is. And you know, it's interesting. I've seen as many companies undervalue their company as overvalue. So that's where I come in, and we try to use analytics to help them figure out what the real potential value of the company is. In 2021, we added a fifth point to this 10-year-old document, and that was about pivots in the business plan. And it's not unusual that a company will enter into a funding program and find out that something in their technology is not working. They have to tweak it or fix it. So like one pivot is kind of expected. But if there are a lot of multiple pivots, that's a real red flag. And if it turns out to be 4 or 5, you have to understand what I'm doing. I'm talking to different equity funders in New York and Boston and San Francisco. They look at me and they say, "Are you crazy? Crazy, what is this company? Is it a subscription model? Is it what is it?" And so if those 5 criteria are met, I can possibly proceed. But otherwise, it's a roadblock. And I can go through David's cases, and I could find a hole in probably every one of those based on those 4 principles. I've seen a lot more complicated analytics. This group called Octane has one called Haystacks. It's so complicated, I can't even understand it. One of our other network members, Don Lavoie, has 19 points, and I have 5. So we all have our way of looking at business, but hopefully we're getting smarter when we get this gray hair and do a better job.
Professor Carleson, one of the key parts of your books is that traits of the investor community can recognize to identify dysfunctional entrepreneurs based on their egos. Is that right?
Yeah, in the book, I identify 4 traits or patterns, but I've added a 5th, having worked with a couple of more entrepreneurs in the last couple of years. The first one is a trait that has been devastating for the entrepreneurs and their families, and it's, "I know what's best, so the law doesn't really matter." And in chapters 1, 4, and 5, the violations were ultimately detected, and fines and prison sentences were imposed on those entrepreneurs that had this notion the law doesn't matter. A second one is minority interests do not matter, except at the beginning when they're raising money. Third, don't question me, I have superpowers. In negotiations and several others. The fourth one is, and this is really devastating for some of the entrepreneurs I've worked with. "I have a great product for a particular market, but it can do so much more." One of my entrepreneurs consistently told groups that even though he was looking at a $500 million market, it was really only secondary. And so instead of exploiting this massive market, he kept adding new things. And then finally, not in the book, but a later conclusion is entrepreneurs can be easily seduced by the new shiny object and suddenly start looking in new directions. So those 5 traits, I think, for the venture community, they have to watch out for entrepreneurs either in early stage or mid stage that display these traits.
And David McConnell, have you seen these traits that David Carleson identifies in his book?
I've seen a little bit of everything, been around for a while. And I think a good read for anybody is this book, written by Dr. Fred Haney, about what's really required for early stage companies to get started. In fact, that's where I met Garret, at the Monday Club, which is sponsored by Dr. Haney. And it can help people modify their behavior and expectations, because business and personal relations are defined by expectations. And this really defines it and nails it very good.
Yeah, this is Dave Carleson. Let me clarify one thing. Garret said that, I didn't have any trouble interviewing people. Actually, all these stories are firsthand. I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but I knew all of the CEOs, I knew all of the founders, and all of these are first-person stories based on actual experience.
And since you represent the entrepreneur on this panel, Garret, so why do you think this ego problem is so big for entrepreneurs and so unfortunately common?
Yeah, it is. First of all, let me ask the two people who are outsiders always can look better than insiders understanding. And Dave McConnell, I'll ask you, in your experience with tech founders, do you see what Professor Carleson's been talking about? Do you see the problem of ego entering into the equation?
Yes, some people are coachable, and some people are agreeable to counseling and wise counsel, they call it, and some are not. I'll give you an example. There's a young man that runs a company that makes a swimming pool filter that's based on solar power. So there's no wires connecting it to the grid. It just takes sunlight and it filters. So it has cartridge filters underneath the disc, and it has a pump, and it's run by electricity from solar panels. That's pretty cool. It saves the users a lot of money from their electric bill, maybe $300 or $400 a month. And so you can write a pro forma that shows that it pays for itself. But where this entrepreneur went crazy, he said, I'm Mr. Swimming Pool expert. I know everything. And I started really shuddering and wondering about that. And so I took him to Tech Coast Angels, and they really liked the company. They really wanted to fund him. And they told him that they thought that his company was worth $2 million. And he said a bad word and said, I think the company's worth $20 million. And this guy had a high school education. I mean, this was not a Nobel Prize winner or something like that. And so they said, listen, you have to be reasonable. Your company is worth 1/10 of what you think it is. And so he said another bad word. And 2 years later, he came back to me. He had orders from Walmart and from big box stores like Amazon and things like that, but he couldn't fulfill them because he couldn't buy inventory. And so he begged me on his hands and knees, basically, to take him out to get debt funding, which I hate. And we got him what's called hard money. Well, nobody's ever happy in a deal like that. He got his money. He paid through the nose for it, but he didn't listen to these guys about his valuation. Our Tech Coast Angels would have given him $1 million a long time ago, and he would have been off to the races. And I'm not sure he had enough IP to protect this idea. Clever as it was, I can't imagine the barrier to entry was very high.
And fellow CEOs or aspiring CEOs or once in the future CEOs, the key word Mr. McConnell just said is coachable. And that's something that I can say, I struggle with sometimes, and I know other tech people struggle with. And Professor Carleson, I'll let you comment on this, because most tech CEOs I see aren't, are inventor types. And to have an idea, like the gentleman who created the pool thing you're talking about, you're like, okay, I see it. I envision it. And they're objective oriented. And the brain is wired to say, okay, this is the idea. These are the steps I need to take to get it done. And then anyone who says something outside of it, it's very easy if you're brain is tracking that way. Extremely easy to say, you're an ankle biter, you're distracting me from my cause, and to dismiss them. Okay? And I warn other CEOs to watch that personality trait. Because yes, you got to stay focused, you got to keep the fight, but humans will make the company. And if humans don't want to work with you, then it's going to be a real problem, you know? And I'll let you comment on that, Professor Carleson, any way you look at it in your book.
Well, for many entrepreneurs, it's nearly impossible to arrive at this balance between a healthy ego, and by that I mean an ego that allows an entrepreneur to go boldly where no one has gone before, and at the same time recognize limitations. Steve Jobs may be the only exception in the last 100 years. I mean, he really was kind of a sole practitioner, but he saw the world as it was going to be when others around him didn't. But despite the fact that Elizabeth Holmes wore black turtlenecks, she was no Steve Jobs. And I just taught a couple of sessions at Chapman on her story, and it's a tragic story. Now, of course, she's serving 9 years in prison, but so many entrepreneurs have this problem of balancing a bold ego and enough humility to actually listen to the people around them.
So, Professor Carleson, so how can an entrepreneur recognize this in himself and thus run a self-check on himself?
Well, you know, my audience is focused on three. I mean, my book is focused on three audiences: entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial programs for teaching. Second, venture capital folks that need to get yellow flags, and then entrepreneurs themselves. It is highly likely that the entrepreneurs who most need to read this book will not do so. Again, in order to pick up a book like this, you have to have at least enough self-awareness that says, maybe I can learn something. But so many of the entrepreneurs in the book were, in fact, actually antithetical to that. A couple of them basically said out loud to staff, I can do, this one particular guy, which led to the book, I can do anything in this company better than anyone else who is assigned to it. And you can imagine what kind of morale booster that is for a director of sales or technology. But that was his stance. And that led to the don't question me, I have superpowers. And by that he meant I can do anything any of you do better. So the balance between an ego bold enough to do new things and the humility to recognize that maybe I don't know everything, it's a delicate balance. And I'm afraid my 11 entrepreneurs in the book didn't execute that balance.
And Garret, do you try to use any of these in your daily existence?
I have to admit that Mr. McConnell on this call, he did help me on the concept of coachable. That and that's what all CEOs, I think, that and startup guys have to do whenever, is that it's in our nature to fight. You don't start something like this if you don't fight. You just have to, you know. But it's also also has to be in our nature to listen to those who are experts in their field, and that's something that's tough.
And David Carleson, is there anything else you'd like to add? And where can we find you in your book?
Well, at the present time, you can find me teaching at Chapman University. I teach a course called Entrepreneurial Failures, Identifying the Root Causes and How to Prevent Them. And we just spent a week on Sam Bankman-Fried and the FTX Alameda disaster. And then a couple of weeks, as I just said, on Elizabeth Holmes and the Theranos disaster. It's in the Chapman University Center for Entrepreneurship and Ethics. And by the way, Chapman just ranked 4th in the nation for most graduates who founded businesses in the same state. So we're very proud of the entrepreneurial programs at Chapman. I also teach blockchain technology's impact on business at the University of California, Irvine. So that's where I can be found these days. I am very pleased that this course at Chapman will allow me to spend a couple of weeks teaching my book.
Perfect. And Dave McConnell, how can people reach you?
I put my contact information in the chat, and I encourage anyone who's interested in selected topics to reach out. Those 5 points that are the screening template are available free. It's called a Summer 2013 newsletter prepared for Tech Coast Angels, and not changed much since then. Also, through our network that David and I maintain with JJ and my co-founder, Andrew Lowe, we have a digital library with interesting stuff about things from incorporating a business to selling a business, managing a business, engineering, and so on and so forth. These are free pieces of information, so it's another way you get advice digitally. You read an article, so reach out.
And Garret, since there's been a little startup CEO bashing here, why don't you tell the audience what you invented and built here at UTest?
That's a great question. Yeah. So what we did with the energy and the hubris and all that type of stuff is take the problem of identities. Let's focus our brains a second on identities and identities that live in the corporate world, the corporate and the B2C, B2B, B2E world, and take those identities and actually understand who we've given permissions to. And that sounds like an obvious thing for the outsiders, but those who live in a world of IT know that IT identities tend to grow, keep on growing and growing, their permissions, and they have to be contracted. There has to be brakes on the car. And that's what we built here at UTest. We built better brakes on the identity car to help people understand who they've given permissions to audit these identities, remove ghost and privileged accounts, remove those accounts that the hackers love. They love to stay in our systems. Accounts that are removed, they're orphans. They increase their dwell time. And it creates the evidence. The evidence that the company is doing due care on their identities, and that's using HIPAA and high trust and PCI DSS and SOCs and SOC 2s. And we're going to be talking to someone from Europe today. So then the DOPAs and the CMMC, all the identity audits that UTest created are used in all of these compliance measures. And we've automated it and made it more simple for people to use.
Perfect. And Garret, can you comment on how UTest can be used to meet the principle of least privilege, as well as meet the guidance in the Stop Ransomware Guide?
Yeah, we could just say hello on that concept. That's what UTest does. In the practical world, when identities are sloppily managed, that's not implemented in principle of least privilege, hackers jump in and they take control of them, and they do nasty things like ransomware. We'll give you some demos and all that. Just reach out to us and we'll show you how.
Perfect. We at UTest can be reached at utest.com or just write us at info@utest.com. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Professor Carleson. Thanks for the insight, David.
Well, thanks, Garret and Ashley and the other David. Appreciate it.
All the best.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye.